Hello, and welcome to a segment of On the Asia Exploration. In this segment, we will look at the impacts of trade between the New World and Europe. As you'll find, it's an exciting time in world history, as European powers began to explore previously unknown areas of the world. The New World was built on the economic principle which spurred great levels of trading and the creation and instruction of cultures and societies, like the Pilgrims and the Aztecs, respectively. This economic method was called mercantilism, where countries of great powers and limited raw materials like France, Britain, Spain, and Portugal. Colonization was a key strategy to gaining wealth. At the heart of mercantilism stood navies and merchant ships whose sole purpose was to bring profit to their mother countries, rather than create areas for settlement. Mercantilists, who were often statesmen and traders, believed the natural world had scarce resources and that there were inherent economic limitations in the global marketplace. It was widely believed that nations could only gain wealth at the expense of other countries and empires. Trade routes became tightly regulated, and there was a clear lack of trust between countries. In particular, colonies were barred from trading with nations other than their own. For this reason, the freedoms of the colonies were limited. Colonists soon became motivated to trade with one another due to cheaper prices, which helped foster, as one historian described it, the golden age of smuggling. This was the beginning of many disobedient actions on the part of the colonists. In sum, mercantilism brought France, Britain, Spain, and Portugal into further conflicts. All of these countries raced to materialize on the natural resources of the New World. The mother nations would fight to obtain more lands, find new trade routes, and create colonies that would mine natural resources, shipping them back to the home country. The confrontation between the Europeans and the Native Americans began in a devastating fashion. The spread of disease, known as the Columbian Exchange, killed thousands of people on both ends. Smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, typhoid, and bubonic plague were a few deadly diseases that spread in the New World. Smallpox, in particular, was initially the largest threat to Central and South American indigenous people, due to the contact with their conquistadors. Measles and scarlet fever later affected the more northern Native Americans, where all diseases were equally at fault for wiping out populations. Although there were victims at both ends of the spectrum, Native Americans suffered many more deaths. Native American tribes tended to be made up of smaller populations and often distanced themselves from one another. In comparison, Europeans lived in populated cities and traveled between towns for trade, exposing themselves to far more forms of diseases, thereby gaining immunity. In the New World, Europeans contracted syphilis by mating with Native Americans women. But the impact was relatively small in comparison to the devastation inflicted on the natives. The most important resource brought from the New World was gold. Systems were put in place to ensure the mother country received an adequate supply of gold. Firstly, gold miners had obtained a license from the governor of the area they worked for, which stated they promised to return with the gold. Upon returning, the gold would be smelted and stamped with the correct name of the town it came from. This assured no one stole anything, but it also created jobs overseas and expanded the economy of a nation. To expand further, Columbus even suggested a designated sect of individuals who had abstained from becoming gold miners. People with other occupations such as farmers, clerks, and traders were essential to sustaining a successful society. At this point, the purpose of the towns was still to bring income to the mother nation. But a long-term plan was made for people to create their own lives in the New World and eventually govern themselves. Towns expanded, and the jobs that were meant to support the miners eventually became long-term careers. Societies that once served to act as central hubs for mining in the name of their mother countries transformed into small republics that demanded more freedoms. Gold has famously been the most precious and the largest sign of wealth throughout the majority of history, but the fight for more resources did not only revolve around gold. Newly found tulips captured the eye of rich nobles in Europe, so the demand and price of them shot through the roof, as countries were fighting to obtain the best and most beautiful flowers. The introduction of tulips to the European powers created an obsession with flowers because of the belief that they could attract the opposite sex. Due to this, they had a high monetary value because of how rare and beautiful they were to the Europeans, and only the rich nobles were able to afford them. This caused desire and competition between nations. At the height of the tulip bubble, the cost of a tulip bulb was around the equivalent of 2,000 pounds of cheese. The tulip phenomenon is a good example of the introduction of a foreign good into the developed economy. The tulip became a high-value product, a fad that steered the economy to produce even more tulips. We will see similar phenomena with the spice trade, and in particular, salt. As you can see in this historic image, the harvesting of tulips were among many resources which demanded for an increased amount of labor, and that brought the introduction of encomiendas, which were essentially slaves of the Spanish. The demand for resources from the New World soon outgrew the production capability of the population. Slaves, a consistent cheap labor force, were then introduced to carry out this labor. Initially they were called encomiendas, a group of Native Americans that had been enslaved by the Spanish conquistadors. Diseases introduced by the Spanish killed hundreds of thousands of Native Americans, resulting in a shortage of slaves. Soon thereafter, the Europeans turned to the ports along the western African coast to import slaves. Instead of using political power and military force, African countries willingly sold slaves to the Europeans. The African supply of slaves came from different regions of the continent, and were gathered and sold to Europeans for weapons. The slaves were then often taken to the West Indies, where they were traded for sugar or other New World items, and then shipped back to Europe. It is estimated that 9 million slaves were migrated during this process. This was all due to the demand for resources to trade back to the nation of Europe. This influence wrote a violent history throughout the Americas for the next 200 to 300 years. It resulted in multiple civil wars throughout countries. Trade from the New World to the Old World not only influenced cultures, but created and destroyed them. On one hand, demand for gold and spices caused the majority of Native Americans' populations to die out through disease. But at the same time, it created nations and entirely new groups of people who can trace their roots back to the European powers. Those nations were driven by the idea of mercantilism, and through the trade of resources, it changed history forever.